Sarah always had a taste for luxury. That's how we ended up at that new fancy restaurant in town. A place that had more Michelin stars than I could count. She'd been hinting about it for weeks, saying we needed to celebrate, even though it wasn't our anniversary, her birthday, or anything particularly special. When I asked her what the occasion was, she just smiled, with that perfect lipstick smile, and said, "Just because. Sometimes you need to treat yourself." I didn't mind. I liked seeing her happy, and honestly, after a long few months of feeling disconnected, I hoped this might be what we needed. But things started feeling off almost as soon as we sat down. She kept looking over her shoulder, scanning the room. Her laugh was louder than usual, her jokes a little forced. And then her phone rang. A different ringtone than usual, something soft and almost eerie. I watched as her face shifted, the bright smile replaced by an expression I couldn't read. Without even glancing at me, she snatched up her phone and slipped away from the table, mumbling something about it being work. Now, here's the thing. Sarah worked in an art gallery. It wasn't the kind of place where emergencies happened at 9:30 p.m. And yet, she looked nervous, almost like she was afraid I might overhear something. I watched her walk out of sight, and a knot formed in my stomach, one that had been tightening for weeks. 5 minutes turned into 10, and I finally decided to get up. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Honestly, I just wanted to know why she'd left me alone in a restaurant full of strangers while she whispered into her phone. I headed towards the restroom area, keeping to the shadows of the dim hallway leading to the exit. And that's when I saw her, standing just outside the entrance, her back to me, with a hand clenched around her phone and a finger pressed to her ear. "Listen, I told you I'm busy tonight. I can't." "No, I said I'd handle it. Just give me more time." "Handle what?" I stopped myself, waiting just out of sight, my heart pounding. Sarah sounded desperate, almost pleading. There was a pause, and I watched her shoulders tense, her head tilting down slightly. "No, he doesn't know anything," she said finally, her voice softer now. "I've kept it hidden, just like we agreed." I moved back before I could hear anything else. I went to the bathroom, turned the faucet on, and splashed water over my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Hidden? Hidden what? My mind raced through possibilities, each more bizarre than the last. But the worst thoughts lodged in my chest, refusing to leave. When I got back to the table, Sarah was already there, her phone neatly tucked away in her purse, that bright smile plastered across her face like nothing had happened. "Sorry, babe," she said. "Work nonsense. You know how it is." I nodded, forcing a smile back, but the entire rest of the night was a blur. I watched her sip her wine, watched her fingers dance along the stem of the glass, and all I could hear were those words repeating in my head. "He doesn't know anything." That night, when we got home, Sarah went straight to bed, mumbling about being exhausted, while I stayed in the living room, sitting in the dark. I needed to know what she was hiding. This wasn't something I could brush off. I grabbed her laptop, something I'd never even thought of doing before. She usually worked on it late into the night, claiming it was gallery finances, exhibition planning, all the things I never asked too much about. But tonight, it was just sitting there, and curiosity got the better of me. I opened it, and there it was, an email inbox with a name that wasn't hers. An alias. The first few messages were normal discussions about paintings, some about sales. But then I found one with the subject line, "Funds transferred." And it hit me like a punch to the gut. $10 million. $10 million. Hidden in a series of accounts with her real name nowhere in sight. The email thread was long, going back years, and every word I read felt like another blow. This wasn't just about the money. There was something much deeper, something she had kept from me for a long, long time that I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every single time I closed my eyes, I'd see Sarah's smile, hear her laugh, and then picture that email about $10 million. How had she hidden something so enormous from me, right under my nose? It made no sense. She wasn't an heiress. She wasn't some genius investor, and I knew what we made. Our finances were steady, but we weren't millionaires. When she woke up, I acted like everything was normal. I made coffee, kissed her on the cheek as she wandered into the kitchen. "Good morning, babe," she said, still groggy, that perfect facade in place. My hands were shaking as I handed her the mug. She didn't even notice. All I knew was that I needed answers, but I needed to be smart about it. She had kept this secret for years, and the way she'd whispered on that phone made me realize something deeper was going on. Something dangerous. Even, I couldn't just confront her yet. I had to be sure. I called in sick at work and spent the day digging. Every single moment she was out of the house, I was on her laptop, her emails, her bank accounts. It wasn't just one account. It was many, spread out across different banks, all under different aliases. And the transactions, the last few were recent, huge sums moving from one account to another, but there was no obvious destination. No explanation, no trail I could follow easily. But it wasn't just the money. There were names in those emails, people she'd been contacting who I'd never heard of before. One in particular stood out. Daniel. His name appeared over and over, always connected to the largest transfers, always with instructions to keep things quiet or wait until the situation is stable. I scrolled further and found an email from just last week. Sarah had written to him, "Meeting went well, still no sign of suspicion. He's clueless." I had to put the laptop down and take a breath. He's clueless. That was me. She was talking about me. It felt like a fist clenched around my throat. 16 years of marriage, and I was clueless. 16 years of building a life, trusting her, and she thought I was a fool. I knew I had to meet this Daniel. I couldn't just sit around and keep reading half-truths and hidden conversations. I needed to see who this man was and what he meant to my wife. Sarah had mentioned a work trip that was supposed to last a couple of days, starting today. It was my chance. She left that afternoon, suitcase rolling behind her, and gave me a smile and a soft kiss before she walked out the door. "I'll call you tonight," she said. I watched her car disappear down the road before I made my move. The name Daniel wasn't enough, but there was an address in one of the emails. A place downtown, a penthouse in one of those shiny new buildings that had sprung up over the past year. It was a long shot, but I was desperate. I needed to know who this man was, and more importantly, I needed to know what he had to do with Sarah's secret money. I drove across town, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding. I had no idea what I was planning to do when I got there. I didn't know if I'd knock on the door, try to sneak in, or just watch from a distance. But I had to go. I had to see it for myself. The building was sleek, glass and metal, the kind of place that screamed money. I walked into the lobby, my eyes scanning for any sign of security, but the desk was empty. I saw the elevator doors closing and sprinted for it, sliding in just before they shut. I pressed the button for the top floor, the address from the email. When the doors opened, the hallway was silent. It was lined with only a few doors, each one spaced far apart, the kind of luxury that meant privacy. I walked down to the door that matched the address, my heart thudding in my ears, and I heard it. Laughter. A man's laugh, loud and careless, followed by a woman's voice. A voice I knew all too well. It was Sarah. I froze, the world narrowing down to that door and the muffled sounds behind it. She was supposed to be on a work trip. She was supposed to be miles away, not here, laughing with some man in a penthouse I'd never known existed. I leaned closer, my ear nearly pressed to the wood, straining to make out the words. "Don't worry, Danny," she said, her voice dripping with that playful tone she used when she wanted something. "He's not going to find out. He never even checks. I've got everything covered." I took a step back, my mind spinning, my hands trembling. I wanted to kick the door in, confront them both right there, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear, it was the realization that this went beyond just infidelity. There was something calculated here, something that went deeper than just a fling. I turned and left, my head spinning, my chest tight. I couldn't think straight. She wasn't just lying to me. She was plotting, planning, and I still didn't know why. But I knew one thing for sure, whatever game she was playing, it wasn't just about cheating. It was about control, and I wasn't going to let her keep that control any longer. When I got home, I started making my own plans. This wasn't just about catching her anymore. It was about turning the tables, about making sure that whatever she had hidden, whatever she thought she could get away with, she would regret. I didn't know how yet, but that $10 million was going to be part of it, that I didn't confront Sarah that night. Instead, I let my mind sharpen into focus. The betrayal I felt was slowly solidifying into something else. Something harder, colder. It was time to stop being reactive, to stop watching from the sidelines while she played her game. The $10 million she was hiding was going to be my leverage, but first, I had to find out exactly what Sarah and Daniel were up to. The following day, I reached out to an old friend of mine, Mark. We hadn't kept in touch much since college, but he owed me a favor, and he was in the kind of business where secrets weren't exactly secret. Mark was the kind of guy who could make records disappear or, better yet, appear exactly where they were needed. When I explained what I needed, he didn't ask too many questions. Just a low whistle and a man. This sounds like some deep S***T, but I'll help you. Within hours, I had everything I needed. The real names behind those aliases, bank account numbers, transactions, and a whole lot more information about Daniel. Turns out, Daniel wasn't just some random fling. He was an investment advisor, at least on paper, but his track record suggested otherwise. Fraud, money laundering, schemes that went south. Daniel was the sort of guy who made money for people who didn't want anyone to know they had it. And it hit me then, this wasn't just an affair. Sarah wasn't in love with Daniel. She was using him, manipulating him just like she'd been manipulating me. She'd been funneling money through him, using his expertise to hide it, to grow it in shady deals. She wasn't some helpless wife. She was the mastermind here, and that only made the betrayal worse. All these years, she'd been living a double life, playing the perfect spouse while lining her pockets. The next step was finding out just how far she'd gone. Mark got me access to Sarah's private accounts, and there it was, confirmation that she had moved significant sums in recent weeks. I found something else too. A series of payments made to a legal firm, along with a draft of a divorce agreement, one that I had never seen before. It was meticulous, cold, calculated. She was planning to leave me, but not just leave. She was going to walk away with everything. There was a note attached to one of the transfers, written in Sarah's signature terse tone. Need this finalized by next month. No mistakes. She was planning to blindside me, and she was going to use that money to make sure I was left with nothing. My hands tightened into fists as I read those words, the anger burning through me like fire. I had given her everything. Years of my life, all my trust, my loyalty. And this was her plan? To strip me bare, take every cent, and walk away with this fraud of a man? But if she thought she could get away with this, she was wrong. She had no idea what I now knew. And I was going to make her pay for every lie, every secret she'd kept from me. I waited until she came home that night. She walked through the door, her face bright and cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "Hey, babe," she called, dropping her keys into the bowl by the door. "You won't believe how long the gallery meetings were today. I'm exhausted." I watched her as she moved around the living room, her back to me, completely unaware of the rage boiling beneath my calm facade. "You must be tired," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "Long trip, I imagine." She paused for a moment, glancing at me. There was something almost calculating in her eyes, but it vanished quickly, replaced by her usual warm smile. "Yeah, you know how it is," she said, and for the first time, I realized just how easily she lied. How effortlessly she looked me in the eyes and fed me these stories. I nodded, pretending to look interested. "Why don't you go relax?" I said. "I'll get dinner started." She smiled again and leaned in to kiss me, her lips brushing against mine with a familiarity that now felt repulsive. As she disappeared up the stairs, I clenched my jaw. Everything in me wanted to drag her back down, to scream at her for what she'd done. But I knew that wasn't the way. Not yet. I waited until I heard the shower start running. Then I opened the safe in our bedroom closet, the one where we kept passports, deeds, and documents. Among the papers was a USB drive I had planted earlier in the day, one that now contained all the information I had on her and Daniel. The hidden accounts, the transactions, the emails, everything that tied them together in their dirty web. This drive was my ticket, my leverage. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to take back control of my life. And then I saw something else in the safe, something I had never noticed before. A small black notebook, tucked behind some old files. I pulled it out, flipping it open, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just a notebook. It was a ledger, names, amounts, dates. A list of every transaction she'd made, every person she'd dealt with. And next to each name, a note. A reminder, a piece of leverage she held over them. This wasn't just about money. Sarah had been blackmailing people. She had turned her little fortune into a network of favors, secrets, and threats. I stared at the pages, the true weight of her betrayal settling in. She wasn't just lying to me. She was running a whole criminal enterprise right out of our home. I heard the water shut off upstairs, and I knew my time was running short. I slipped the notebook back into the safe and locked it, tucking the USB drive into my pocket. Sarah came back downstairs, her hair wrapped in a towel, a content smile on her face. "So, what's for dinner?" she asked, like everything was perfectly fine. I looked at her, at the woman I had loved for so many years, and for the first time, I didn't feel heartbreak or sorrow. I felt a cold, calculated resolve. "Something special," I said, smiling back at her. Something just for us. And as she turned away, I knew exactly what I had to do. She thought she was in control. She thought she had it all figured out. But now I had the truth, and soon enough, she was going to find out just how dangerous it was to underestimate me. The following day, my entire world turned into one thing: preparation. The anger and heartbreak were still there, but I used them like fuel, igniting the fire in my chest and making every decision crystal clear. I couldn't afford another misstep, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let Sarah know I was on to her. Not yet. I took a leave of absence from work, told my boss I had family matters that needed attention. It wasn't far from the truth, and frankly, he owed me enough favors not to ask too many questions. I needed the time to make sure every detail was in place. Mark helped me go deeper. He got me records that exposed Daniel's entire history, along with connections to some very unsavory types. Men whose names had been whispered in backrooms and always attached to dirty deals. Daniel wasn't just a fraud. He was involved with organized crime. There was one thing I needed, though: a face-to-face with this guy. It was time to let Daniel know that I was no longer clueless. I found out where he worked, one of those sleek investment offices downtown, the kind with tinted glass and security at the front. I wore my best suit, the one I hadn't taken out since Sarah's gallery opening 2 years ago. When I walked into the building, I could see the receptionist sizing me up. She must have assumed I was another prospective client, someone looking to put their money in Daniel's hands. I used that to my advantage. "Good morning," I said, giving her my best polished smile. "I'm here to see Daniel Sharp. He's expecting me." She nodded, flipping through her appointment book, and before she could say anything, I added, "Tell him it's regarding Sarah. He'll understand." That got her attention. I watched as she glanced up at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "One moment, sir." She picked up the phone, her voice dropping to a whisper as she spoke into the receiver. I waited, my heart pounding, but my expression stayed calm, collected. A few moments later, she gestured towards the elevators. "Mr. Sharp is on the 5th floor. You can go up." The elevator ride was short, but the time felt stretched out, the seconds ticking by like minutes. When the doors opened, I stepped out into a hallway lined with expensive art, the kind that looked like someone had splashed paint at random but probably cost more than my car. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar, and I walked towards it, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I knocked once, then pushed the door open without waiting for an answer. Daniel was sitting at a large, polished desk, his eyes widening slightly when he saw me. He was younger than I expected, with slicked back hair and the kind of smile that seemed permanently on the edge of insincerity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but wary. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "You're Daniel Sharp, right?" I said, my voice low, controlled. "I believe you know my wife, Sarah." For a split second, I saw it, the flicker of recognition, the way his jaw tensed just slightly. He tried to cover it up, leaning back in his chair, that fake smile sliding back into place. "I'm sorry, I think you must be mistaken," he said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "No mistake," I replied, pulling out the USB drive from my pocket and holding it up. "I've got everything, Daniel. The accounts, the emails, the transfers. And I know exactly what you and Sarah have been doing." He went pale, the smugness dropping from his face in an instant. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you can't just come in here and—" I cut him off, stepping closer, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. "I'm the man whose life you've been messing with, and I'm here to tell you that it ends today. You see, I don't care what kind of games you've been playing with Sarah, or what kind of schemes you've got going on. But what I do care about is that $10 million. Daniel's eyes widened even further. He was scared now, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out what move to make. "This isn't just about money," he finally said, his voice trembling. "There are people involved. People you don't want to mess with." "Maybe," I said, giving him a cold smile. "But you see, Daniel, I'm not afraid of them. In fact, I'm betting that those people you're so worried about, they're going to be a lot more interested in what you've been doing behind their backs." I leaned in closer, locking eyes with him. "Unless, of course, you help me. You're going to tell Sarah that the deal's gone south, that the money's been frozen, that everything needs to be put on hold. You're going to make her panic. And when she does, she'll come running, right into the trap I've set." Daniel swallowed hard, the fear in his eyes unmistakable now. He was cornered, and he knew it. "And if I refuse?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Then I send every bit of information I have to those people you're so scared of." I let them know how you've been skimming off the top, playing both sides. Trust me, they'll be a lot less forgiving than I am." For a long moment, he just stared at me, his face a mask of desperation. Then, finally, he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "All right," he said, his voice hollow. "I'll do it." I stepped back, slipping the USB drive back into my pocket. "Good," I said. "And just so we're clear, if you try to warn her, if you make one wrong move, I will make sure you're the one left with nothing. Understand?" He nodded again, and I turned, walking out of his office without another word. The door closed behind me, and I let out a long breath, my hands trembling slightly. It had worked. I had him. Now all I needed was for Sarah to take the bait. When I got home that night, Sarah was in the kitchen, a glass of wine in her hand, humming to herself. She looked up as I walked in, giving me that same bright smile. "Hey babe," she said. "How was your day?" I smiled back, forcing my voice to stay light. "Oh, you know, the usual. Nothing too exciting." She nodded, taking a sip of her wine, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit her. I watched her for a moment, the way she moved, the way she looked at me like I was just another piece of the background. It was almost laughable, how she still thought she was in control. But soon she would learn the truth. Soon, everything she'd built, every lie she'd told, was going to come crashing down around her. And I would be there watching as she realized just how badly she had underestimated me. The trap was set, and now it was just a matter of waiting. Every nerve in my body was on edge, the anticipation almost unbearable. I watched Sarah closely over the next few days, pretending everything was normal while keeping tabs on her every move. Daniel had played his part. He'd contacted Sarah, delivered the story I'd given him. Accounts frozen, authorities sniffing around, the kind of news that would make her panic. And sure enough, Sarah started to unravel. It was subtle at first. She paced the kitchen more than usual, her eyes darting to her phone every few minutes. She was quieter, her smile tighter, as if every word she spoke was a strain. She'd disappear for hours, coming back with vague explanations about problems at the gallery. But I knew better. She was scrambling, trying to figure out what went wrong, trying to fix something she didn't realize was already beyond repair. On the third day, it happened. I came home from a quick errand and found her in the living room, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice sharp, panicked. I stayed just out of sight, listening. "What do you mean it's over?" she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, Daniel, you can't just pull out now. I need that money back. Do you hear me? You owe me." There was a long pause, and I could hear her breathing, heavy and uneven. I imagined Daniel on the other end, probably just as scared of her as he was of the people I'd threatened him with. Sarah had always been good at making people bend to her will, but this time, she was facing the consequences of her own games. She hung up, throwing her phone onto the couch with a frustrated growl. She paced the room, her hands running through her hair, her eyes wild. It was a look I'd never seen on her before, pure desperation. And then, as if a switch flipped in her mind, she grabbed her bag, rushed towards the door, and was out before I could even make a sound. I followed her. I had planned for this, prepared for the moment she would make her move. I knew where she was going. There was one person she always turned to when things went sideways, her sister, Emma. Emma lived across town, in a small house that was the exact opposite of Sarah's taste. Cozy, cluttered, with a garden that was always a bit overgrown. It was her safe place, her retreat, and today it was going to be my stage. I parked a block away, watching as Sarah pounded on Emma's door, her face twisted in frustration. Emma opened it, her eyes widening in surprise before she quickly stepped aside to let Sarah in. I waited a few minutes, then made my way to the door. I didn't bother knocking. Instead, I turned the handle and walked right in. The sight that greeted me was almost comical. Sarah was sitting on Emma's couch, her head in her hands, her face pale. Emma stood next to her, awkward and concerned, her hand on Sarah's shoulder. They both looked up as I entered, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Sarah's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "John?" she stammered, standing up quickly, her voice cracking just slightly. "What are you doing here?" I gave her a smile, one that I knew didn't reach my eyes. "I think it's time we had a little chat, don't you?" Emma looked between us, confusion etched across her face. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Sarah, is everything okay?" Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was scrambling, I could see it. The gears turning in her head, trying to come up with a story, a way to explain all this away. But I wasn't going to give her the chance. "Emma," I said, my voice calm, almost friendly, "why don't you take a seat? You might want to hear this too." Emma hesitated, her eyes wide, but she sank into the armchair opposite Sarah. I watched Sarah, her face going through a cycle of emotions. Fear, anger, and finally, that cold mask slipping into place. "You've been lying to me, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice steady. "About a lot of things. About Daniel. About the money. About everything." I pulled the USB drive from my pocket, holding it up so she could see. "I know about the accounts, the transfers, the money you've hidden. I know what you've been planning." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, Sarah laughed. A short, harsh sound that cut through the room. "You don't know anything," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "You're just trying to scare me." I stepped closer, my eyes locking onto hers. "You want to test me, Sarah? Because I'm done playing the clueless husband. I've got every email, every transaction. I know you've been working with Daniel to stash that money, and I know about your little plan to leave me high and dry. It's over." Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Sarah, is this true?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah's eyes flicked to Emma, then back to me. For a split second, I saw something in her eyes. Panic, the realization that she was cornered. And then she turned to Emma, her voice softening, her face crumpling into a mask of faux sorrow. "He's lying, Em. You know him. He's always been jealous, always suspicious. He's making this all up." "Enough." My voice was sharp, cutting through her performance. "I have proof, Sarah. It's not just some story. You've been planning this for years. You were going to leave me, take everything, and disappear with Daniel. You think I don't know about the divorce papers you were drafting?" Sarah's face paled, the color draining from her cheeks. Her eyes darted to Emma, who looked like she'd been struck. "Divorce?" Emma whispered, her voice cracking. "Sarah, what is he talking about?" For the first time, Sarah had no words. She opened her mouth, closed it, her hands trembling at her sides. The mask had fallen away, and I saw her for what she truly was. Calculating, ruthless, and utterly exposed. I turned to Emma. "I'm sorry you had to hear it this way," I said, my voice softening slightly. "But your sister has been lying to both of us. She's been stealing, manipulating, planning to betray everyone around her. And now, it's time she faced the consequences." Emma stared at Sarah, tears welling in her eyes. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Were you really going to leave him? Take everything?" Sarah looked at me, then at Emma, and for a moment, I saw something almost like regret. But then her face hardened again. "You don't understand," she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "You never understood. I did what I had to do. You think I was just going to sit there, living that boring life forever? I deserved more. I deserve more." I took a step back, shaking my head. "You had everything, Sarah, and now you're going to lose it all." She glared at me, her eyes narrowing. "You think you've won? You think you're the hero here?" she hissed. "You're just as pathetic as ever, John." I turned away, her words sliding off me. They had no power anymore. "Emma," I said, my voice calm, "I think it's best if you take some time away from her. There are things I need to deal with, and they're going to get messy." Emma nodded, her eyes wide and filled with shock. She looked at Sarah, then back at me, and finally, she stood up, her hands shaking. I need some air," she whispered, and without another word, she rushed out of the room. The door slammed shut, and for a moment, it was just the two of us. Me and Sarah, the woman I had loved, now standing before me as a stranger. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel any love, any pain, or any loss. All I felt was the cold satisfaction of knowing that I was finally free from her lies. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice low and dangerous. I smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. "No, Sarah, the only one who's going to regret anything here is you." And as I turned and walked away, I knew that this was just the beginning. Sarah had built her empire on lies, manipulation, and greed. Now it was time to watch it all come crashing down, and I'd make sure I had the perfect seat to witness every moment of her downfall. The air between us felt like a live wire, sparking and dangerous. When Emma left, the entire room seemed to shrink, closing in around Sarah and me. She stood there, her hands clenched, her expression defiant. But I could see the fear creeping in. The veneer of control she had held for so long was cracking, and all that remained was a raw, desperate version of her that I'd never seen before. I didn't give her time to speak. I walked past her, into the living room, where I had set up my final move. On the coffee table lay copies of the documents I'd pulled from her secret stash. The divorce papers, the account details, the blackmail notes. There was something almost satisfying about watching Sarah's eyes widen as she followed me, seeing the evidence laid out before her like a grotesque buffet of her betrayals. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice strained, though I could hear the tremble beneath her words. "You think this changes anything? You think you have power over me now?" I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I picked up one of the papers, a ledger showing the transactions she had orchestrated through Daniel. I held it up so she could see, letting the numbers, the dates, and the aliases tell the story she tried so hard to hide. "You've been lying for years, Sarah," I said, my voice even. "And this is what you've built with all those lies. A hidden fortune that you thought would save you from this life. From me, from all the things you decided weren't good enough anymore." She laughed, but it was brittle, almost hysterical. "You really think you're some kind of detective, don't you? You think because you found some papers and heard some phone calls that you have any idea what I've been dealing with? I did this for us." She pointed at the documents, her hand shaking. "I did this because you were too small-minded to dream bigger, to see what we could have had if you just let me handle things." I shook my head, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. "For us? Is that what you tell yourself, Sarah? Because last I checked, for us didn't include secret meetings, an affair with a criminal, and $10 million hidden in offshore accounts." She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off, stepping closer, my voice growing colder. "You used me. You used our marriage as a front while you played your games, hiding money, making deals. You planned to leave me broke, Sarah. You wanted to strip me of everything and run away with that scumbag, Daniel." My voice rose, and I felt the rage boiling over, the months of deceit crashing over me like a tidal wave. "You think I didn't see the way you looked at me these past months? The way you smirked every time I believed another one of your lies?" She flinched, but her gaze didn't waver. She stood her ground, her chin lifting slightly in defiance. "I did what I had to do. You don't understand the kind of pressure I was under. Daniel was supposed to be a partner, someone who could help me move the money quietly, someone who knew how to play the system. You think I enjoyed it? Being with him?" She spat the words, her eyes narrowing. "I did it because I had no choice. You wouldn't have survived in the world I wanted to build. You're too weak." I felt something snap inside me, a cold finality washing over my anger. I took a step back, shaking my head. "You're wrong, Sarah. I'm not weak. I was just trusting. I believed in you, and you took that and twisted it into something ugly. You thought you could get away with it all, that I'd never see through the lies. But here we are." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, my thumb tapping the screen a few times. The call connected, and I held it up, the speaker blaring as Mark's voice came through clearly. "Everything's in place, John," Mark said. "Just say the word, and the documents go out." Sarah's face went pale. Her eyes widened, and for the first time I saw real fear. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice cracking. I stared at her, letting the silence stretch between us, savoring the way her expression shifted from shock to desperation. "All your associates, the people you've been blackmailing, they're about to find out just how much you've been hiding from them. Every secret, every transaction, every lie. It's all going public. Your empire, your little fortress of secrets. It's all coming down." "No!" she screamed, lunging towards me, her face twisted in panic. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging in, but I didn't flinch. "You can't do this. You'll destroy everything. You'll destroy me." Her voice broke, tears streaming down her face as she clung to me, her pride and defiance crumbling away in an instant. "Please, John," she whispered, her voice barely audible now, her hands trembling against my arm. "You don't understand. They'll come after me. You don't know the kind of people Daniel's connected to. If this gets out, I won't survive it. Please." I looked down at her, the woman I had loved for so many years, now broken and pleading at my feet. And all I could feel was a cold emptiness. She had taken everything from me. My trust, my love, my sense of safety, and twisted it into something vile. I was done protecting her. "You should have thought about that before you decided to betray me, Sarah," I said, my voice emotionless. I turned back to the phone, taking a deep breath. "Mark, send it." "No, no, no, no," she cried, her voice rising in desperation, her grip on my arm tightening. But it was too late. I heard Mark's confirmation over the line, a simple "it's done." And then I ended the call, slipping my phone back into my pocket. Sarah sank to the floor, her sobs filling the room, her hands clutching at her hair, as if she could pull herself back from the edge she had fallen over. I watched her, feeling nothing. This was the end of the woman I had loved, the one who had once been my partner, my confidant. But this version of Sarah, the schemer, the liar, she had never truly been mine. She had been a stranger all along, and now she was facing the consequences of her own making. "Pack your things," I said quietly, turning towards the door. "I want you out of the house by tonight." She looked up at me, her eyes red, her face twisted in a mixture of hatred and sorrow. "You'll regret this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I swear you'll regret it." I paused at the door, glancing back at her one last time. "No, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "The only thing I regret is not seeing the real you sooner." And with that, I walked out, leaving her behind, her sobs echoing through the empty house. The life we had built together, the lies she had spun, the empire she had tried to create, it was all in ruins now. And for the first time in months, I felt freed. I drove away from Emma's house with a strange, unsettling calm in my chest. The storm had passed, the confrontation was over, and now all that remained was the wreckage of what used to be my life. Sarah's sobs still echoed in my mind, but they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else, someone I no longer knew. I pulled over to the side of a quiet road, my hands resting on the steering wheel. I needed a moment to process everything, to let the reality of what I'd just done sink in. I'd torn down every lie, exposed every secret, and watched as the life Sarah had built around deception crumbled. There was a kind of satisfaction in it, but it was hollow. This wasn't a victory. It was just an ending. As I sat there, my phone buzzed. It was Mark again. "Hey man." His voice came through, sounding cautious. "Just wanted to let you know." The emails went through. Every contact on that list got what they needed to see. Some of them are already responding. "It's intense. Intense," I repeated, my voice distant. "Yeah, I don't think Sarah's going to have many friends left in her world after this," he said. "I even heard from one of my guys that a few of them are already scrambling, trying to cut ties, cover their own tracks. She really stirred up some nasty stuff, John." I closed my eyes, nodding to myself. It was what I expected. Sarah's empire wasn't just a personal one. It was built on the backs of people who had just as much to lose as she did. And now that it was all coming to light, they were going to do whatever it took to protect themselves, even if it meant throwing her under the bus. "Thanks, Mark," I said, my voice heavy. "I appreciate everything you've done." There was a pause, and then Mark spoke again, his voice softer. "You okay, man? I mean, really? I know this wasn't easy." I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I don't know if okay is the right word," I said finally. "But I feel like I did what I had to do. And now, it's time to figure out what comes next." Mark was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. "Well, if you need anything else, you know where to find me. Just take care of yourself. All right?" I hung up, leaning back in my seat, letting the silence of the car wrap around me. What did come next? The truth was, I had no idea. For so long, my life had been tied to Sarah, every decision shaped by the person I thought she was. Now, all of that was gone, and I was left with nothing but the pieces. I spent the next few days in a kind of daze. Sarah had left the house, just as I'd asked. When I came back that night, the place was empty. Her clothes gone, her presence erased as if she had never been there. I walked through the house, the silence pressing in on me, and it felt both like a relief and a loss. This was supposed to be our home, a place where we built memories, where we raised our family. Now it was just a shell, stripped of everything it once meant. I tried to distract myself, to keep busy. I started clearing out the things she had left behind. Photographs, trinkets, all the small pieces of our life that no longer held any meaning. I packed them into boxes, one after another, until the house felt bare, the echoes of our past fading into nothingness. But amidst the silence, there were still echoes of what had happened, ripples from the bomb I had dropped. The phone calls started coming. People we knew, friends, acquaintances, people who had heard rumors but didn't have the full picture. They all wanted to know what had happened, why Sarah had suddenly disappeared, why her name was popping up in whispers around town. I ignored most of them, letting the calls go to voicemail. I wasn't interested in explaining myself to people who had never really known the truth about our marriage. They had seen the version of us that Sarah wanted them to see, the polished, perfect couple that had it all. They didn't know the lies, the betrayals, the ugly reality that had been hiding beneath the surface. But one call I couldn't ignore: my lawyer. He'd received word that Sarah had filed an injunction, trying to block me from accessing our shared accounts, claiming that I was trying to ruin her financially. I almost laughed when I heard it, the irony so rich it was almost unbearable. She was the one who had tried to destroy me, and now, in her desperation, she was trying to paint herself as the victim. It was typical Sarah, always trying to twist the narrative, always trying to find a way to come out on top. I met with my lawyer the next day. He was a sharp, no-nonsense kind of guy, someone I had hired specifically because I knew he wouldn't be swayed by emotions or drama. He went over the paperwork with me, laying out Sarah's claims, and I felt the anger simmering beneath my skin. "She doesn't have a leg to stand on," my lawyer said, his tone dismissive. "Given what you've uncovered, it's clear she's trying to cover her own actions. We can counter this easily, but you need to be prepared. If she's desperate enough to do this, she might try something more." I nodded, the weight of it all pressing down on me. "Do whatever you need to do," I said. "I just want this to be over." As I left his office, I realized just how tired I was. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. This fight had drained me, taken everything I had, and now all I wanted was peace. I wanted to move on, to leave Sarah and her lies behind, but it seemed like she was determined to drag this out, to make it as painful as possible. That night, as I sat in the living room, the emptiness of the house pressing in on me, I thought about what I really wanted. Revenge had driven me this far, the need to expose Sarah, to take back the power she had stolen from me. But now that it was done, what was left? I didn't want to keep fighting, to keep reliving the pain she had caused. I wanted freedom. From her, from the anger, from the past. I picked up my phone and dialed Mark. When he answered, I spoke before he could say anything. "I need one more favor," I said. "I need you to help me make sure she can't touch me or anything I own ever again. I don't care what it takes. I just want her out of my life for good." Mark was silent for a moment. Then he let out a slow breath. "All right, John, I can do that. But you know this won't be easy. She's not going to let go without a fight." "I know," I said, my voice steady. "But I'm done being afraid of her. I'm done letting her control my life." When I hung up, I felt a sense of resolve settle over me. This was the final step, the last piece of the puzzle. I was going to make sure that Sarah had no more power over me, no more control, no more ways to hurt me. She had taken everything from me once, but now I was taking it back. And when this was all over, I would finally be free. Free to rebuild, to start over, to find out who I was without her shadow looming over me. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. A spark of something that reminded me that life could be more than just survival, more than just a battle against betrayal. Could be mine again. I woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. The conversation with Mark had solidified my decision. This was it, my final step towards freedom. I spent the day contacting my lawyer, setting up meetings, making sure every legal loophole Sarah might try to exploit was sealed shut. My entire life had been thrown into chaos by her deceit, and now I was going to restore order no matter what it took. The house, though empty, began to feel less like a reminder of what I had lost and more like a blank slate. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt oppressive. It was starting to feel like peace. I packed more of Sarah's things, leaving the boxes by the door for her to collect, though I doubted she'd have the nerve to come back here anytime soon. And then, an unexpected phone call came, an unfamiliar number on my screen. I hesitated, then answered. "John," a man's voice, smooth and self-assured. "This is Daniel." I was taken aback. The last thing I expected was for Daniel to contact me directly. My fingers tightened around the phone, the old anger sparking again. "What do you want?" I said, my voice colder than I intended. "Before you hang up, just listen," Daniel said quickly, a note of urgency in his voice. "I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." I paused, curiosity battling with my instinct to tell him to go to hell. "You've got 2 minutes," I said flatly. "Look, I know you're angry. You have every right to be," he began, and I could hear the anxiety under his polished tone. "But things have gotten complicated. Sarah's not taking this well, And she's not going to go down quietly. She's reached out to some dangerous people I thought I could keep her away from. She's planning something, John. Something that could get both of us in deep trouble. A chill ran down my spine. I had already expected Sarah to fight back. But this? Reaching out to dangerous people? It was as if she was willing to risk everything to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. What kind of trouble? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The kind that involves cleaning up loose ends, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a whisper. She wants to get rid of all evidence, including me, and you, if you get in her way. I'm telling you this because I want out. I never signed up for this level of risk. I thought it was just money, but it's getting darker and fast. My mind was racing. Sarah had always been calculating, but I hadn't realized she would go this far. Threatening me was one thing, but actually reaching out to people who might want to take care of problems permanently? She was out of control, desperate, and that made her dangerous. What do you want from me, Daniel? I finally asked. Why tell me all this? I'm trying to save my own skin, all right? He said, the polished tone gone, replaced by raw fear. I know people who can help me disappear, but I need some leverage. I need to give them something that shows I'm not a threat, that I'm out of the game. And I need you to stay out of it, to not make things worse for me. I clenched my jaw, my mind reeling. This was spiraling into a level of danger I hadn't anticipated. I'd wanted to expose Sarah, take back my life, but now it seemed like the stakes were higher than I had imagined. I don't trust you, I said finally. You've been lying from the start, and now you expect me to believe you just want out? I don't care if you trust me, Daniel shot back. But I swear, John, I don't want anything to do with this anymore. I'm leaving, but if you keep pushing, she's going to do something drastic. I'm giving you a chance to walk away, to let this end without anyone getting hurt. I could hear the desperation in his voice, and for a moment, I considered it. Maybe it was the best option, to walk away, let Daniel vanish, let Sarah face whatever mess she had created on her own. But then the anger flared again, the thought of her still out there, still scheming, still willing to hurt anyone to get what she wanted. Give me proof, I said after a long pause. Proof that she's planning something. Otherwise, I don't believe a word you're saying. Daniel was silent for a moment. Fine, he said. Meet me tonight. There's an old warehouse on Canal Street, the one near the river. I'll bring everything I have. But you come alone, and you don't try anything stupid. This is your only chance, John. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone, my heart pounding. A meeting at a warehouse? It sounded like a setup, like the kind of place you'd see in a crime drama where everything goes wrong. But if Daniel really had proof, if Sarah was planning to escalate this into something dangerous, I needed to know. I spent the rest of the afternoon going over every possibility. I wasn't naive. I knew this could easily be a trap. Daniel could be trying to lure me out to deal with me the way Sarah wanted. But there was also a chance he was telling the truth, that he was as scared as he sounded, and that this was my chance to end it. As night fell, I made my decision. I drove to Canal Street, parking a few blocks away, the river glistening under the moonlight. The warehouse was dark, abandoned, the kind of place that gave you chills even before you stepped inside. I walked slowly, my senses on high alert, every creak of the old building echoing around me. I saw Daniel standing near a stack of crates, his figure barely visible in the dim light. He looked over as I approached, his eyes wide, nervous. You came, he said, a mix of relief and fear in his voice. Let's get this over with, I said, keeping my distance. Daniel nodded, reaching into his coat and pulling out a folder. This is everything, he said, holding it out to me. Every plan, every contact she's made. It's all there. She's not just going to let this go, John. She's too deep in. I took a step closer, reaching for the folder, and that's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps, fast and heavy, coming from behind me. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat, just in time to see two men emerge from the shadows, their faces obscured, their intentions unmistakable. Daniel's eyes went wide. I didn't know, he started, but it was too late. The men lunged, one of them grabbing Daniel, the other coming for me. I moved instinctively, dodging to the side, my heart racing, my mind barely processing what was happening. One of the men swung at me, and I felt the impact as I staggered back, pain exploding in my side. But adrenaline took over, and I fought back, grappling with him, the folder falling from Daniel's hand and scattering papers across the floor. Run! Daniel shouted, His voice panicked, and I saw him break free, sprinting towards the door. I followed, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the sound of chaos echoing behind me. We burst out of the warehouse, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I ran, not looking back, my mind focused on one thing: getting away, surviving. Daniel was ahead of me, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness, and I pushed myself to keep up, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. Finally, we reached the riverbank, both of us stumbling to a stop, gasping for breath. Daniel turned to me, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "They're not going to stop," he said, his voice shaking. "She's not going to stop." I looked at him, the realization sinking in. This wasn't over. Sarah was willing to go to any length to protect herself, and now we were both targets. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not now, not ever. "We're going to end this," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "But we do it my way. No more running, no more hiding. We take her down, and we make sure she can never hurt anyone again." Daniel nodded, the fear still in his eyes, but something else too: determination. He was in this now, whether he wanted to be or not. And together, we were going to finish what she had started. The night was far from over, and the battle ahead was going to be dangerous. But I had faced Sarah's betrayal, her lies, her attempts to destroy me. I had survived, and now it was time to fight back. And this time, I wasn't going to stop until she was finished. The riverbank was still, the only sound the distant hum of the city and our heavy breathing. I stared at Daniel, his face pale under the moonlight, his eyes wide and desperate. There was no running anymore. Only a direct confrontation would put an end to this nightmare. We decided to move fast. The longer we waited, the more dangerous it became. Sarah's connections were clearly real, and now they knew we were a threat. I didn't have much time, and neither did Daniel. We needed to finish what we started, end her web of lies and make sure she couldn't reach us ever again. That night, I drove back to my house, Daniel in the passenger seat. He was a mess. His hands trembled, and he kept looking over his shoulder, as if he expected Sarah's thugs to come out of the darkness at any moment. "She'll stop at nothing, John," he muttered. "You don't know her like I do." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles whitening. "I know her well enough. I know what she's capable of. But she doesn't know me anymore either. She thinks I'm weak, that I'll just sit back and let her destroy everything. Tonight, we end this." The plan was simple. We needed to force Sarah out of hiding, expose her, and leave her with no escape. The documents Daniel had brought to the warehouse, even scattered and incomplete, were enough to tie her to the dangerous people she had threatened to use against us. I called Mark again, and we set the wheels in motion. This time, it wasn't just about emails, it was about turning her own allies against her. We had what we needed: proof of her betrayal, her hidden accounts, and her dealings with criminals that no one in their right mind would want to cross. If we could deliver this information to the right people, people who were already wary of Sarah's double dealing, we could cut her off, make her untouchable in the worst possible way. Even the kind of people Sarah was dealing with had a code, and breaking trust in their world was the ultimate sin. Mark worked quickly. By morning, the information was in the hands of those who mattered, the powerful players in Sarah's shady network. And then we waited. It didn't take long. Sarah showed up at the house later that day. She didn't knock. She stormed in, her face flushed with fury, her eyes wild. "John!" she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. "Where are you?" I was ready. I stepped into the hallway, watching her, feeling nothing but a cold resolve. She looked different, disheveled, desperate. This wasn't the composed, confident woman I had once known. This was someone on the edge of losing everything, and she knew it. "You did this?" she hissed, stepping closer, her hands trembling. "You think you can just ruin me? You think you can take everything from me and walk away?" I stood my ground, my expression calm. "You did this to yourself, Sarah. You lied, you stole, and now everyone knows the truth. You wanted to play a dangerous game, and now it's come back to bite you." She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You have no idea what you've done," she said. "They're coming for me, John, and if they can't get to me, they'll come for you. You're not safe. You never were." I took a deep breath, stepping closer, my voice steady. "Maybe, but at least now I'm free from you. You can't hurt me anymore, Sarah. You can't manipulate me, and you sure as hell can't control me." Her face twisted, a mix of anger and something else, something almost like fear. "You think you've won?" she whispered. You think this is over? Before I could respond, Daniel appeared from behind me, his face pale but determined. It is over, Sarah, he said. We've made sure of it. Your contacts have turned on you. They know you're a liability, that you can't be trusted. You're finished. She stared at him, her eyes widening in shock. For a moment, there was silence, and then she lunged at Daniel, her face contorted in rage. You traitor, she screamed, but I stepped between them, grabbing her arms, holding her back. Enough, I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty house. It's over, Sarah. You're done. She struggled for a moment, then went still, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of hatred and something else, something that almost looked like regret. You could have had everything, she whispered. We could have had it all. I shook my head, my grip loosening. No, Sarah, what you wanted wasn't real. It was all built on lies, and I'm done living in your fantasy. For a long moment, she just stared at me, her eyes searching mine, as if looking for something she had lost. Then, slowly, she stepped back, her shoulders slumping. The fight had gone out of her. Without another word, she turned and walked towards the door. She paused for a moment, looking back at me, her expression unreadable. You'll regret this, John, she said quietly. One day, you'll realize what you lost. I met her gaze, feeling nothing but a cold emptiness. Maybe, but at least I'll know it was real. She left, the door slamming shut behind her, and the house fell into silence. I stood there for a long time, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. It was over, really truly over. Daniel let out a shaky breath, sinking onto the couch, his hands still trembling. What now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I looked around the empty house, the place that had once been filled with so many memories, both good and bad. Now we move on, I said. We let her face the consequences of her own actions, and we start over. Daniel nodded, though he still looked unsure. I didn't blame him. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with unknowns, but it was a path I was willing to take. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had control over my life again. The next few weeks were a blur of legal battles, negotiations, and dealing with the fallout from everything Sarah had done. The people she had crossed were ruthless, and it wasn't long before word came back that she had fled. Left the city, possibly even the country. She was running now, just like she had tried to make me run. But I wasn't running anymore. I was staying. I was rebuilding. I sold the house. It was too filled with ghosts, with memories of a life that no longer existed. I found a small place on the outskirts of town, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could start fresh. Daniel vanished, just like he said he would, leaving behind no trace. I didn't blame him. He needed his own kind of freedom, and I hoped he found it. And me? I was finally free. Free from Sarah, from her lies, from the life that had been built on deceit. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of it all felt like too much to bear. But each day, I felt a little lighter, a little stronger. I didn't know what the future held. Maybe I'd regret some of the choices I'd made. Maybe I'd find myself missing the good moments I'd shared with Sarah, the love that had once felt so real. But I knew one thing for certain. I was done living in the shadows of someone else's lies. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to see what life had to offer. On my own terms.